All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to this edition of Noisy Reality. My name is Jim Dingman, and today we're going to deal with the wider phenomena of Trump's media policy. The title today is Twisting the Press, Media Policy in the Reign of Trump 2.0. We're very happy tonight to have as our guest tonight and tomorrow. But let me first talk about tonight. We have Professor Jane Kirtley, who's the SILHA. Is it SILHA? Is that the right pronunciation?
No, the H is silent. It's like Scylla and Charybdis.
Ah, Scylla and Charybdis. Okay. The Scylla Professor of Media Ethics and Law. She's the director of the Scylla Center for the Study of Media Ethics and Law at the University of Minnesota. She is an affiliated faculty member at the University of Minnesota Law School and has held visiting professorships at Suffolk University and Notre Dame Law School. She was a Fulbright scholar who taught in Riga in Latvia during the spring of 2016. Now, Jane has written Friend of the Court briefs in the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as two books, Privacy Rights in the Digital Age and Media Ethics Today, Issues, Analysis, and Solutions. She has served as the executive director of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press for 14 years in Washington in the past. And before that, she practiced law in New York, Virginia, and Washington, D.C., and reported for newspapers in Indiana and Tennessee. She is a Pulitzer Prize juror from 2015 and is a long member of the board of the Sigma Delta Chi Foundation. She is here to talk to us today about the media policy of Mr. Trump, which I know we have a lot of interesting people here on the phone, including people who've worked in the media. So it's going to be a lot of fun to talk to you. So welcome, Professor Kirtley.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Well, first of all, what, when we think of Trump in the media, we always contrast what happened when he ran for president back in 2015, 2016, and how he completely surprised everybody with his skill. I never forget Les Moonves talking about how like he's making a lot of money for us at CBS, and he got, I don't know, what they estimate, about $1 billion worth of advertising for free or something like that, some ridiculous number. But how do you compare that Trump, the Trump 1.0, coming up with what we're dealing with now in Trump 2.0 in terms of the media?
Well, I think to kind of to start with, I think it's important to remember that when Trump first came into office, it was kind of amateur night as far as he was concerned. He liked being a media personality. That was largely the tide he rode to get elected, trading on his time at The Apprentice and so forth. And I think he wanted to be accepted by the media, just as he wanted to be accepted by the elite in New York. And although he had a lot of saber rattling in terms of talking about calling the news media the enemy of the American people and so forth, for the most part, I think he was sort of prepared to let things go to a certain extent. He also was surrounded by people that I think recognized that you couldn't really burn your bridges with the media and expect to succeed. Changed completely when he came into office most recently. He has been absolutely crystal clear that he intends to control the narrative, that he wants to consolidate power in the media in the hands of people who support him, that he will do anything he can to use the instrumentalities of the executive branch to beat the media into submission. If he can't do it through the libel suits and other spurious suits that he's brought against many news organizations, if he can't do it by excluding the legacy media from press pools and things like that, which are all tactics he's been using, he does all of that. But above and beyond that, I think he's recognized that he can really hit the media industry where it hurts by using the Federal Communications Commission and, to a lesser extent, the Federal Trade Commission to block and impede mergers, acquisitions, and other kinds of regulatory authority that the federal government has to stymie these owners of the media in doing what they want to do.
Well,
And
yeah, go on.
sorry, go ahead.
No, go, please, please, go on, go on.
And I'm just saying that his naked use of this power, which began even before he was sworn in, with the choice of appointees such as Brendan Carr at the FCC, has made it really clear that the gloves are off now. And if you don't want to play and go along, well, as Carr has said, they can do it the easy way or the hard way. If they don't comply, there are going to be consequences.
Now, one thing we know with the relationship of the public with the media is that it's been downhill since the 60s. There's no ambiguity about that. The issue of he could get away with this whole question of fake news, because you and I both know, and the people who are listening to this know, that fact-based journalism that's sourced, that's investigated, and double, triple sources, you're going to make some important assertion, uh, is as a quote, you're trying to be quote objective. You can never can be totally objective, of course, but you're trying to be objective when you make some assertions that can pin people in power. But to get to the point where you have a large percentage of the population, basically, we don't care. Who cares what, you're from a legacy media? Who cares? Why do you explain how you understand we've gone to this point?
Well, I think you're right that this is not something that Trump invented. He's exploited it, but he did not create it. The distrust from both the political right and the left in the so-called legacy media has been going on, as you said, for 40 to
Decades.
50
Decades, yeah.
years at least. And and to some extent, as a journalist and a lawyer that represents journalists, I'm not completely unsympathetic for the idea that people should be skeptical about the sources of media that they turn to, and not take anything at face value. Famously, State's News Service in Chicago said, if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. I mean, you don't take anything at face value. But the problem, I think, is that with this assault on the credibility of the media, the notion that you can't trust anything that you're being told because they're biased, because they have an agenda. That word objectivity, I think, is a really dangerous word. I mean, I was trained on it in journalism school. The word I have preferred to use is independence, because I think it's easier to demonstrate independence than it is objectivity, because I think you're right that nobody is truly objective. Um, the key is to be independent and to have as your highest priority serving the interests of the public, at least as you see those interests, and not that of any particular political party or any particular political agenda. To me, that's what makes good, solid, independent journalism. But now we're in a situation where everyone's looking at the information they glean through a partisan lens. And with the rise of social media and other alternative forms of information delivery, which includes misinformation and disinformation delivery, with the use of algorithms that channel people in certain directions that, for the most part, reinforce the beliefs they already have, we have a highly polarized news sphere at this point. I've encountered this with people that I know who, when I try to dispute with them on a factual thing that I think is very straightforward, they will say something like, well, I have other sources of news.
Mm.
And those are the ones that I believe, not what you're telling me, or not what, pick your media outlet is telling me. And that, again, the kind of the cliche of the idea that everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but we need a baseline of facts from which to discuss and debate. Um, that baseline has been so eroded at this point that I think it's really difficult to sort of get back to the basic idea that certain things are going to be decided and determined to be factual. The problem, I think, is that sometimes the conventional news media that have ethical standards that say things like, if we find out we made a mistake, we're going to correct it, it didn't used to be this way, but I feel as if now it is. That is then pointed to say, see, you can't trust them. You can't believe what they're saying because they got this wrong, even though they're perfectly happy to go to some source like TikTok or some other social media platform where there's absolutely no sense of what those content creators are thinking about, what their motivations are, what kind of fact checking they go to, if any. And you and I talked a bit a couple of weeks ago about the Nick Shirley viral video, and to me that is emblematic of what we're talking about here, which is that people watched the Nick Shirley video, and some of them took it completely at face value, said it was absolute proof that these daycare centers in Minneapolis were defrauding the public and not taking care of children and so forth, when there was absolutely no factual predicate for what Nick Shirley was saying, but it reinforced a narrative that they chose to believe.
Yeah, and that, of course, and when, I'm thinking of, I used to follow Patricia Opera at American University because she was
Yeah.
very much into reception of news. And I remember I went to a conference at Yale about Iraq, Afghanistan films. And her whole argument was that none of these brilliant films have had any impact on the public because the box office. She would go to Box Office Mojo and show like, some brilliant film, like let's say something that Laura Poitras did. Nobody went to watch it. So, it was just an amazing phenomena to see. And last night I was talking to a Cornell sophomore who was sitting there absolutely having me in stitches because she starts to describe how we've gotten to the point where a influencer named Clavicular is arguing that because that Governor Newsom is a better looking person than J.D. Vance, he has now been able to persuade all these young Gen Zs to support Governor Newsom for a presidential race. And I'm saying to myself, wow, wow, we have really got into a new space. Now,
Well, I'll just push back on that a tiny bit because I mean, just think back. You and I are old enough to remember the Nixon Kennedy
yes, John
debates.
Kennedy, right?
I
Yes,
mean, physical attractiveness can be a factor in electability,
right,
whether we want to believe that or not.
right.
But
Touche, touche.
be that as it may.
No, no, and you're right about that. And of course that's a reality. Now, but get further into this social media issue because you have Trump in the first administration, the whole question of fake news right away. He's saying, "Oh, look at those guys in the back. They're all a bunch of the fake news." And that resonated. That resonated. And how do you understand how that resonated?
Um, I think again it goes back to the basic skepticism that the public has had about the media. I mean, if you read online comments on any media source, what you'll often see is people saying, "I want to go back to the days of Cronkite. I want to go back to the days when the news media just told us what was going on and didn't inject their own viewpoints or their own commentary."
Yeah.
And I think, whether that perception was
Yeah, if
reality or
it's true
not,
or not, yeah.
that is what people really bought into. Now, of course, part of that was because the news ecosystem was very different in those days. We had three major networks at that point. Now we've got all of these broadcast cable, over the air, other kinds of networks, plus social media and all of that. So it's a very different world than it was then. Um, but I think ultimately people are very much eager to have their own viewpoints reinforced. And when they had to read a variety of print media or broadcast media that would challenge them, whether they wanted to be challenged or not, they couldn't help it. I mean, I remember years ago when I was still on the Reporters Committee, one of the founding members, the late Harding Carter Jr., said to me one time, I have to read the Wall Street Journal every day because I have to know what they're thinking. I mean, the point was there was value in challenging yourself by looking at another viewpoint, to kind of test what your beliefs and prejudices were. people don't have to do that anymore. And I think to the extent that they wanted to find that kind of reinforcement or did not find it, Trump played into that by saying, you see, they're lying to you. They must be lying to you because I'm telling you what's true, and they're not
Yeah,
because they're evil, liberal,
right.
whatever particular epithet you want to use.
Now, describe to us how you understand. Is this tactic that he's used, for example, the way he went after Stephanopoulos
Yes.
and shook them down for what, $15 million or something like that?
Yeah.
Is this new? And how do you understand? Have you taught this in law school to students and discussed this?
Oh yeah. I mean, the whole Trump tactic of bringing suits, it actually, in many respects, reminds me of a whole bunch of lawsuits that happened in the 1990s, where, and it began with a case that some of you may remember involving the Food Lion grocery store chain. ABC had gone in undercover to do a story about bad food practices in this particular grocery store, and they chose a state where it was not illegal to use hidden cameras, so that was not a legal impediment. What Food Lion did when after they had, contacted Food Lion to make sure that the videos were actually authentic, which was an ethical thing to do, Food Lion immediately sued them not for libel, but under a whole bunch of other legal theories, including sort of straightforward things like trespass, but also interference with business relations, things like that. They were suing effectively because they wanted to make a libel claim, but they knew they couldn't because what ABC had published was true. But they launched this huge public relations campaign to convince everybody that ABC had acted essentially unethically in doing the story. It took years to get this suit resolved and ended up with all the claims being thrown out except one and a very small monetary award being made. I think it was a couple of dollars at the end of the day. Of course, ABC spent millions of dollars defending themselves. But the point is, this was the first big salvo of basically trying to sue under a theory that was not libel. Why would you do that? Well, because that way you could avoid being bound by the standard of New York Times versus Sullivan from 1964, which
Describe
says
that. Describe the importance of that.
exactly, yeah, terribly important case, arose during the civil rights movement, involved a low-level police commissioner in Alabama who sued the New York Times based on what today we would call an advertorial, talking about things that were happening to civil rights workers and others in the South. And there were some factual errors in it. And the New York Times was sued over that under the theory that they had published something that was false, and that by implication it had defamed this commissioner who was not even named in the advertisement. What the Supreme Court ruled in an opinion by Justice William Brennan was that when a public official sues for libel, that individual must demonstrate that the publisher acted with what we call actual malice. It's a term of art that means that you knew it was false or that you acted recklessly in publishing it. Doesn't mean necessarily you have ill will. It's a very specific term meaning the action, knowledge of falsity, reckless disregard for the truth. This ruling, which originally was only for public officials, was extended in subsequent cases to include public figures, which includes like corporations, things like that. Huge barricade to any public official or public official to successfully bringing a libel suit because it's a very difficult standard to meet. And so somebody like Trump and somebody like Food Lion back in the 1990s would say, this is such a hard standard to meet that I'm not even going to try to sue for libel. I'm going to sue under some other theory where the Supreme Court has not said that the standard is so high. So Trump has been doing two things on that front. He's been suing for libel multiple times, and many people think his goal is to eventually get it to the Supreme Court to ask them to re-examine the New York Times versus Sullivan standard because he's made it very clear he would like that to go away.
Right.
But also to bring suits under other theories like fraud, for example, consumer fraud, which is one of the counts he's brought in some of his other suits against the media. again, to do an end run around the New York Times versus Sullivan standard. So even if that standard remains intact, there might be another legal theory under which he could sue. And that's what Food Lion did. And that's what there were a bunch of these cases in the 90s, which media lawyers refer to as trash torts. They kind of went away, but Trump has revived them again. And the question is whether the judges that are in place now will be more receptive to these alternative theories. I mean, essentially, what the courts said up until recently was, we see what you're doing. We know that you're really trying to sue for libel without suing for libel. And if the goal is the same, which is to chill speech, to chill legitimate reporting and commentary on public officials, you're not going to get away with that. You would still have to prove actual malice. So I think that's what's going on here. It's an attempt to first erode New York Times versus Sullivan. And if that doesn't work, then to use these other theories to accomplish the same thing, which is to essentially try to bankrupt news organizations or cow them into silence.
So talk about another aspect of this, and that is the analysis of or recompositioning of press pools, like sort of in the Pentagon, or how he's valorized. I knew the guy who set up Newsmax. I knew him because we were competing over a story 30 years ago, and he was trying to have me assert in a public setting that I felt public television deserved to be defunded. And I said, I'm not going to do that. What are you, crazy? I'm not going to say that. But that was his goal.
Right.
And so now, of course, he has established Newsmax, and we see what's going on in the White House right now with the way they're reorienting the whole press conferences. So how do you see that? Is this new or old, or is this repeated what we've seen before?
Well, historically, there have been attempts over the years, not so much in the White House, but for example, on state and local level officials, to basically freeze out news organizations from press pools or their equivalent if those news organizations are not covering the
Playing the
office in
game.
the way
Yeah.
they'd like it to
Right.
happen. The famous case involving the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, where this came up. And what the courts had said repeatedly was, of course, you can have reasonable restrictions on who can be in a press pool, in the sense that your room only holds so many people and you can't have 1,000 people there. So you can have principled reasons to draw distinctions between different news outlets. But what you cannot do is bar them because of their ideology or because of their viewpoint. And what we're seeing with Trump is just this brazen. I mean, it's really it's like the exact opposite of the way it should work. I mean, but he's coming. They're coming right out and saying, we don't like the way you're reporting on us, so we're going to bar you. I mean, the first salvo was the Associated Press, because it refused to use the terminology Gulf of America, and they got excluded from some of the press pools. You mentioned the Pentagon press pools. I mean, let's be clear. Pentagon press pool situation has been a flashpoint for a long time. I mean, in my experience, it goes back to the
Since the Vietnam
invasion
War. Since the
of Grenada,
Right, right,
the Persian Gulf
right,
Wars. I
right,
mean, this has always
right,
been something, because there's always been tension
right,
between the military and the media.
right,
But again, the blatant nature of this reorganizing of the press pool,
right,
first with the new memo or the first memo that came out, that basically said that if you want to be a member of the press pool, you have to be prepared to submit your copy for prior review. I mean, again, it was like what they tried to do during the Persian Gulf War, and they weren't able to do. That if you even ask a question that could implicate national security, broadly defined, you could lose your press pass for that. I mean, it was extraordinary in terms of the breadth of this. And then finally, the line in the sand was, you've either got to sign off on the revised version of that agreement, or you lose your hard pass to the Pentagon. All the news organizations that were current members refused to do that, I think with one exception. And they were simply summarily replaced with news organizations, using that term loosely, that were prepared to abide by it. Now, of course, that doesn't mean they can stop these other organizations from reporting on the military or the Pentagon. They can do that, but they are now very constrained in terms of their ability to physically be at the Pentagon. And there's also this kind of ad terrorem clause, which essentially suggests that if people within the Pentagon or the military, broadly speaking, provide information to the media that the government doesn't think they should be giving out, that they can be in big trouble, which is always, the kind of way you get around the obvious First Amendment problem of going directly against the press. You go against their sources, and get them to clam up that way, which is something that Ronald Reagan did. I mean, it's, again, not unique to the Trump administration, but still a big problem in terms of the ability of the media to report on what the government's up to.
Yeah, and you mentioned Grenada, of course, is that's when they start to implement their post-Vietnam press policy, and then it goes into the pool policy during the Gulf War, the embed policy after 9/11. I was asked to embed in 2003, and I was told what the the restrictions were. And I said, well, forget it. You can't do anything.
Right.
And I had friends of mine who went and embedded during the invasion. But
Yeah,
it's
one of just as an aside, one of the things that came up was that when the whole press pool kerfluffle erupted, one of the things that happened was that the Washington D.C. bureau chiefs had a meeting with Pentagon associates and came up with the principles of how reporting was to go forward, because part of what the government had wanted was to reduce reporting on the military strictly to the press pools. And then they were persuaded that open reporting was to be the default, and only in particular circumstances, like if you were on an aircraft carrier or something, would you be able to, or would you have to implement the press pool. But there was a stealth principle, which was a prior review principle, which the bureau chiefs refused to sign off on. And I think the military, never got over their anger at that, because they really wanted to be able to have a prior restraint regimen in place, and the bureau chiefs wouldn't agree to it.
Yeah. Now let's talk about the macro strategy. That is the way Trump is interfering with mergers. Just what happened with CBS. I mean, I personally know uh, Barry Weiss. I knew her when she was an undergraduate. Her opinions haven't changed that much since then. And here you have a situation. I think of all the friends of mine who worked at CBS, who were past, they would turn in their graves to see what's going on right now. But what's interesting about this is how Trump is interfering with the merger process and actually try and maneuver it so he has an outcome favorable to him. In other words, we got CBS under control. You got this other issue where they're always seeking to knock out MS now, but CNN is on the target list. What is that new? Is this a new phenomena, or have we seen this in the past?
Well, there's nothing new under the sun. It's just a variation or apotheosis, I guess, of what might have been, for example, Richard Nixon's dearest dream, because everyone knows the story, I think, of how during the Washington Post's golden era, when it was reporting vigorously on the Nixon administration and Watergate and so forth, that Nixon was very clear that the Washington Post company, which owned a number of television stations, was going to face problems with the Federal Communications Commission when it was time for their licenses to be renewed. Now, Trump, uses the term licensing and so forth in a very imprecise and inaccurate way. He keeps talking about taking away licenses and things in situations that don't exist. The licenses go to individual stations, as you know. Some of the networks own and operate some of those stations, but they themselves are not licensed, and so it's nonsense to talk about that. But it's all this saber rattling, which is code for if you do not comply with what I want you to do, you're going to face problems when the Federal Communications Commission, one, might be renewing your license, too. They've been making a lot of claims now about the networks not operating in the public interest, convenience, and necessity, which is language out of the Communications Act of 1934, talking about news distortion, which is something that the Federal Communications Commission does have authority to deal with, but which historically they've never really done anything with it because it's such a kind of an absurd proposition, at least as the concept is envisioned in the regulations, because and this is the thing that up until really recently the FCC understood. Even though broadcast media do not enjoy full First Amendment protection because they are licensed in the sense that if you're going to operate on a particular broadcast frequency, you have to have a license. So the FCC is the traffic cop that decides whether you're operating in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. But it's hard to lose a license. And it's been very clear from a variety of cases by the Supreme Court and others that you can't take somebody's license away based on their viewpoint. There have to be other justifications for doing that, violations of other rules. Um, so that's kind of the specific thing that Carr has been engaging in a way that I've really never seen before. And I mean, I can remember back when Edwin Meese was the Attorney General, and there were many actions being threatened against the broadcast media for so-called indecent broadcasting. But this is just so blatant in saying that if you're not doing what Carr/Trump wants you to do, you could be in trouble. Then the broader question that you raised, which is about mergers and acquisitions, which have to be approved by the FCC, broadly speaking. I mean, there are exceptions, but in terms of the big things we're talking about, like Paramount, Skydance, Warner Brothers, all of these huge mergers and acquisitions, some of which Trump very much favors. He's delighted at the prospect of the Ellisons becoming sort of the big media moguls that will have control over not just those outlets, but Oracle they already control, but Oracle/Ellison is going to be one of the major shareholders in the new TikTok version that's emerging after Trump basically ignored the congressional pronouncement that it could not be owned by the People's Republic of China and so forth. Anyway, the point is there are many ways to get to the broadcast media. Most of them are financial, but not only. And I think it's really hard to avoid the impression that so much of this capitulation is based on those economic concerns. And then the other piece that we were talking about before, which is the big suits that Trump has brought against them, multi-million, billion-dollar lawsuits, which many of them have chosen to settle. In my opinion, most of these suits had no merit whatsoever, but they chose to settle rather than, I guess, than prolong the litigation or take their chances that later on down the line there would be other economic repercussions above and beyond whatever judgment Trump might get.
Right, and I chortled when you mentioned the 1934 statement about of the FCC intent because I was laughing and thinking about all the times that's been perniciously manipulated over the past 50,
Oh,
60, 70 years. Uh,
of course. And
uh,
I'm not necessarily saying
no,
it's
no,
always been used in good faith or anything like that, but that's what that's what the
right,
statutory language is.
right.
And that's what they're supposed to do. And although it isn't always honored, what we're seeing now with Brendan Carr is it's being used as a weapon.
Right. Now, you all out there, just raise your hands and we'll bring everybody in. So just if you want to ask comments or questions, just do that. And as we get into that, the question of AI, and how they're rushing in with all the, because look at all the, Silicon Bros just moved from their liberal stance, flip-flopping into let's just suck up to Trump at the inauguration. And how do you understand that? Because that, I admit, I personally am learning. But how do you understand this AI phenomenon when we interwrap this with this whole media policy question?
Well, I think The mistake that some of us make is when we look at the tech industry, we think that because it is sometimes engaged in content creation or in helping to advance the dissemination of content, we think of them as operating under principles that conventional media might operate on. They don't, they just don't. If anybody thinks that the Silicon Valley people in the world would look at the kind of ethical questions that journalists would ask, like accuracy, vetting sources, making sure that, yes, you get the story, as quickly as you can, but the first thing is to get it right. Um, those things don't really matter. And the idea of serving the public interest, that's completely, in my opinion, alien to them. They are very much an industry that believes in, you know, asking forgiveness rather than asking permission. Move fast and break things is their mantra. The only place that anybody really seems to be prepared to try to reel them in is in Europe. And even there, it's imperfect. In observing how they have not been subject to regulation during the Biden administration and the Obama administration, it seemed like the only real tool that was in their quiver was antitrust regulation. Because you could argue with a straight face that that was not content based. It simply had to do with making sure that this powerful tool is not concentrated in the hands of only one or two companies, traditional kind of antitrust analysis. And Europe has some success with that under their antitrust laws. But my point is that I think if one tries to think of the whole AI world as one that is driven by the same kind of principles that would drive traditional news delivery, you're going to be disappointed because that's not who these people are. And I'm not saying that necessarily they should be any different than they are. Their priorities are different, their goals are different. What motivates them is different. But again, if you're going to try to look at them in a box that says, okay, this is just the next generation of the media, I don't think that that's true, because I don't think those are their standards. I don't think those are their goals. I don't think those are their missions. And I think honestly, they'll do stuff because they can do it and let the chips fall where they may. And I mean, I won't say they're immoral, but I think they are amoral on these points. As you can tell, I'm not a big fan. As a professor, I have a lot of issues with AI as a institution, for lack of a better term, because I see them, just from a copyright perspective, gobbling up people's work and using it to create their LLMs. This is really kind of beyond my pay grade, but there are plenty of suits going on with conventional media trying to assert their copyright interests in the material that the AI world is just gobbling up and repurposing. But that's kind of a separate issue. What I'm worried about primarily is that I have students now who can see no reason why they should not be using AI to produce material. I mean, as a lawyer, because I teach law students as well as journalism students, I will say to them, are you not paying attention to all of these law firms that are getting in trouble with judges when they submit case briefs and other kinds of documents that have hallucinations that were created by AI? Fake citations for cases that don't exist. And I even had that happen to me in one of my undergraduate classes, where students were submitting answers to questions that included fake cases. And because several of them had the same fake case, I knew they'd all use the same AI bot. And this is concerning to me, not so much because it's so lazy, but because it suggests that there's a real gap in critical thinking that AI encourages. And I think that has long-term consequences in terms of public discourse, if nothing else. But that's probably a discussion for another day.
No, that's a good point. I actually watched two professors admonish 100 students a few months ago precisely on those issues. Anyway, do people have comments or questions? Yeah, go on, Alex. You'd have to unmute. Yeah. Alex, can't hear you. Alex, you'd have to unmute. Oh, he's having a problem with his computer there. There you go. Still a
Yeah,
problem?
sorry, I don't know for some reason my button's not working. Yeah,
Okay.
I think it might be Gramsci he has a quote about something along the lines, but he's talking about empire and saying again, at some point, basically, with especially with declining empires, that the mass basically gets ripped off, and they just start doing things openly, and they don't even care, to put up a pretense. And I think of that in terms of like what Trump has done recently, in terms of Venezuela, and just being outward, just kidnapping a legitimate leader of a country. But then again, yeah, you see the mainstream, well, for lack of a better term, mainstream media, spewing against stuff that any objective person knows is a lie. Like that again, Maduro, that Maduro was beaten in a fair election and it was fraudulent, and the other side won 80% of the vote, which I think again, even people who believe that Maduro lost his last election, none of them would make the absurd statement that again the opposition won 80% of the vote, because again, what election has somebody won 80% of the vote? So yeah, so again, when and again, so that's not necessarily again pro Trump or anti Trump, but that just kind of go pro empire again, say pro U.S. establishment, or pro imperialism. So I wonder what do you think that how that plays into specifically Trump, because I just so again, my own opinion again, it serves to again to undermine um, when again the media kind of again goes along with these American imperialist narratives, and lie about Iraq, lie about Venezuela, lie about Iran. That of course serves to discredit, and then people go on the left and right go why should we even care about that?
Well, I think, there are many many issues in your question, and I'll just hit on a couple that immediately occur to me. One is, I think, of course, we know that governments lie. I mean, they always have lied, they always will lie. There's nothing particularly novel about that. But I do think that the Trump administration has um, weapons that make it much more effective than might have been the case even 10 years ago, even during the first Trump administration. They've become extremely artful in their use of social media and other forms of information delivery. I don't really want to call it news, that resonates with their folks, their supporters, and those who call themselves independent and non-aligned. Um, I don't know how much time you spend looking at government websites since the Doge attacks of a year ago, but in many cases, they do not resemble the government websites that existed a year ago. They've been totally politicized. One of the things that shocks me, and this is probably just a reflection of how old and on some level, not necessarily politically conservative, but sort of socially conservative I am, the rhetoric that's used on those sites, the language that's used on those sites, the kinds of things where, I mean, it's just, to me, very lacking in professionalism, I guess I would say. But it seems to be something that Trump supporters really like. They see it as authentic, more authentic than was the case with prior administrations that had a certain degree of protocol associated with what they did. So I guess my point is, I think that the Trump administration and his advisors are very good at playing these propaganda cards. And I mean, I'm not going to go into all the details because it's not my field, but the comparisons are made between the propaganda during Hitler, very, very similar in terms of approaches that Goebbels and others have taken. And it was successful then, and it seems, at least for some members of the population, to be successful now. Um, there are people out there who have been felt very disaffected, felt like they were left behind, felt like the values that they cherished were being shunted aside by other things. Even here in a place like Minnesota, which people regard as very liberal, the fact is we have a huge portion of our state that is quite politically conservative and has found, well, I won't necessarily say they are cheering on the actions that are being taken in the Twin Cities. They see it in part as a correction of something that needed to be changed because the liberal government of Minnesota was shoving these new ideas down people's throats and so forth. Anyway, that's a long way of saying that I think for many people in the United States, this idea that, what Trump says about making America great again, it resonates with them because they like the idea of thinking of America as a major player in the world, as if it wasn't. I mean, that's the fallacy here, that as if it wasn't. And the kind of strongman tactics that Trump espouses, they take that as a very positive thing. Now you're asking, at least implicitly, about are the mainstream media complicit in this? And of course, there are many people that believe that Trump's first election was directly related to the complicity of the media, finding Trump novel, entertaining, surprising, but in some respects not really taking him seriously, and therefore not pushing against so many of the things that he was proposing the first time around. They always said, don't take him literally, but take him seriously, or something like that. I forget the exact phrase, but the notion was he's speaking a truth, and the details don't really matter. Well, now we're in a situation in the second administration where the details really do matter, and they're making it very clear how they intend to proceed. And one of the greatest pieces of, I will say, journalistic malpractice that I would point to for the last election of Trump was, not by everybody, but by enough of the media, lack of attention to Project 2025, because it was all laid out in that, what exactly the plan was. And, it's easy to say, well, you can go and read it for yourself. But, it was hundreds of pages long. People weren't going to go to read that. And I think the one of the things we should have been doing in the media was distilling that down into digestible pieces so that people would understand what the overall plan really was. And now we're seeing it adopted in real time. And some people are surprised. And if you didn't read it or didn't read about it in the news media, that's why you're surprised. But it was there. It was hiding in plain sight the whole time.
I mean, kind of related to that, yeah, obviously then we can foresee Trump doing other extreme things. I mean, again, we've been talking, with Jim and other people, about the possible use of ICE to basically disrupt the midterm elections, and that essentially, yeah, that's basically what Trump's ultimate plan is, to either call them, oh, they're not valid, we have to keep the
right. I mean,
or
that
just send ICE into places to reduce the vote for Democrats.
I mean, that whole question
And then
about,
but I'm sorry, the point I was trying to make is, I don't see the media anywhere, or at least again the serious media, making that point, or warning about it, essentially, so that when that happens, then are people just going to be completely surprised and then not able to do anything about it?
I mean, I absolutely think interference with the midterms is a real possibility. I think there already was interference in previous elections, and whether you want to say it was foreign actors or somebody else, I think it occurred, and I think it is likely to occur again. I think these are things we need to we need to be talking about. anybody who will just come right out and say, as he said, I'll have confidence in the election if I win, which is what he said the last time. I mean, it's just the notion that but the seeds were planted to create doubt in the integrity of the election, and people were highly susceptible to that. Um, again, it's not, I have to say that I'm not sure that Trump himself is some evil genius. I think he has had the ability, together with his advisors, to exploit these vulnerabilities and concerns that people have and create this narrative that our elections are not secure when in fact, I mean, I'm sure all the evidence is to the contrary, but here we are.
Yeah, he said in the New York Times article he regretted not seizing the ballots in
Yes.
2020, and so who knows what he's up to. Gail, did you want to jump in with something?
Um, just I don't know enough law, but I know you do, Jane. So, has anybody ever tried to make a case against foreign interference in, for example, election reporting, vis-a-vis the Murdochs and their, to me, insidious control?
A legal case, no, not to my knowledge. I think we could draw a line, a through line, I think, back to Murdoch. And I remember many, many years ago, I met a guy who was a columnist for the Times of London when Murdoch owned it. And I was talking about how when I was at the Reporters Committee, I was trying to raise money. That's what you do when you're running a nonprofit. And I said, I want to try to get money from Murdoch. And the columnist said to me, you really don't understand. Murdoch doesn't care anything about the First Amendment. You're not going to be able to appeal to him that way. This is all about, power, control. And, the whole, I don't know, I can't really call it a subterfuge, but the fact that Murdoch became an American citizen solely so he could become an electronic media mogul as well as a print media mogul. This was one of those first kind of chinks in the armor to see, because the whole idea in this country was, as far as our electronic media was concerned, they're supposed to be owned by the United States. You're supposed to be a U.S. citizen. Part of that goes back to the concerns that people had in the 1930s about the pervasiveness of the electronic media and how people were uniquely susceptible to it, that never applied to newspapers. But the fact remains, by letting that start, that was the slide, I think, towards this idea that foreign interference, foreign influence in our media was okay. And I have to be honest and say I have mixed feelings about this as a kind of a general principle, because I did a lot of work for the U.S. State Department over the years in the 80s and 90s in emerging democracies in Eastern Central Europe, places that had been dominated by the Soviet Union and were now independent. And this whole question about whether foreign entities could own media within those countries was a very fraught question, because sometimes they were people that were coming in from civil society groups that were really going to help guide the media into a new kind of independent function, and some had nefarious purposes. And so it's not always easy to say bad, good, black, white, or whatever. But I think the whole Murdoch thing is a great example of how you can have people coming in here who, I mean, like when we were talking before about Silicon Valley, they don't have the interest, for lack of a better term, the altruistic interest that was part of journalism in this country. I mean, I'm not saying that people like Hearst didn't want to make lots of money and couldn't be corrupt, but ultimately they had an understanding about, if you don't serve the public interest, you're not really going to survive. I don't think that that's in these people's playbook. I really don't. It's all about power. It's all about control, controlling the narrative, controlling what people think.
Well, some people knew that Hearst was off the wall, though.
True, true.
I mean, to me, I mean, I'm a academic by training, so I suppose I think there's a problem in education. People get very irate when I say stuff like that, but
I don't get irate when you say stuff like that,
good.
but I think, you know, again, it's complicated. There are many aspects to this, but I think, you know, to my mind, one of the big questions is how much control should the government have over the media, however we define that. And historically, the Supreme Court has taken the rule that the view that it's really dangerous for the government to have a lot of control over the media. So we allow just a bare minimum of control. Talking about the FCC and its control over the air broadcasters, for example, which in many respects are becoming less and less relevant. But once upon a time, that was really, really important. But the idea was First Amendment says government should have a very light hand over this. If we start going the other direction, you're just playing into the hands of Trump because that's what he wants. He wants to be able to control all of the media, not just print, not just broadcast, not just cable, not just satellite, but everybody. And he loves the notion of it being in the hands of his supporters and him having a nice big chunk of it too. I mean, you probably saw the story that came out in the last day or so about Trump's financial advisors having him purchase a bunch of debt in the hands of a number of these companies that are in the process of going through the approval of mergers and acquisitions. And he stands to profit tremendously from that, really almost whichever way it goes.
Right.
But there's no question that his regulators will be critical to deciding what happens with that. And I think he stands to benefit from that. I mean, that's the only possible reason he would have for having acquired those bonds. But anyway, that's probably
Yeah, Netflix. He bought bonds with Netflix, and
yeah.
and it just shows you how important it is for him to crush the midterms, because if the Congress changes, which is likely, forget it. People are going to
Yeah.
come and bring up the emoluments clause and start to go after him.
I,
Now, Greg, Anthony, Aaron, or Kay, do you I want to make some comments? Yeah, go on, Anthony.
Yeah, I might. This is a media universe kind of question, not a legal question, but it's really disturbing when you shared that anecdote about people who are students who had papers with citations to non-existent uh, court decisions. Um, I mean, do they did these students know that the stuff they were handing in didn't exist? And kind of related to that, what of newspapers? Because newspapers are historically the foundation of real journalism, and of course we know that uh, the New York Times or Washington Post of today is probably thinner than the mid-sized city paper of 20 years ago. So where are people going to, and granted, they all had their biases and their editorial positions, but where are people to go for accurate information if the newspaper industry is shrinking and there's all this fake information out there too? Seems
AI
very chilling.
AI slop is what it's usually referred to as these days. That's the phrase that is of the moment. And I'm very anxious about it because we see, you know, it's not even. I mean, I absolutely agree that the shrinking news hole, for lack of a better term, with fewer and fewer independent news outlets, and those that still exist are a shadow of what they once were. I mean, just kind of a parenthetical thinking about your comments, Alex, about, you know, kind of the imperial narrative. I mean, one of the things that helped to counter that to some extent was the fact that the big news organizations had a presence in other countries. They were actually out there with people that were reporting,
Right.
and they had dedicated correspondents who were there. Then that shrunk back to, well, we're going to have freelancers, or, you know, we're going to have stringers, but at least we'll have, you know, a person on the ground. And now they don't even have that. So there's nothing to really counter those narratives. And that is the thing that I think is at the heart of this, that there's nobody to counter the narratives because they don't have any human beings to do it. And what are they turning to? They're turning to AI. I mean, among my colleagues who teach the journalism skills courses, which I do not, the thing they keep talking about is, how are we going to teach our students to use AI? How are we going to, because they have to know how to use AI because they're going to be expected to know how to use AI. And of course, I feel like I'm, you know, I don't know what, trying King Canute, yelling at the tide or whatever to say, this is evil. In my view, this is evil. Evil in the sense that it is contrary to the essential notion of what journalists are all about, which is not taking somebody else's word for it at face value. I mean, that's what AI is ultimately. That's how a student answers a question with a made up case because they don't have the critical thinking skills, or they don't have the, I mean, they're beginning in their study of law, so they don't have the depth of knowledge that somebody like I would have. They don't know any better. What they see is this AI thing has come up with this case, sounds credible to them, and they just plug it in and they don't even think about it. Now, I'm not saying that it was never the case that a student, miscited a case or cited a case for a proposition for which it did not stand because they didn't bother to read it. But this is even worse because it's completely made up. And judges, as I said, are fining practicing lawyers for doing this. So it's not just the students, it's the people that are out there doing it. So having said that, I have to think it's the same with working journalists, sadly, who, with the pressures that they have to produce speedily a quantity of copy. I'm using old school terms here, but those are the ones I'm familiar with. They get sucked up into this too. And I don't see a clear way out of it. I mean, you're asking me, at least implicitly, for a solution. I don't really have one because it seems to me that the pervasiveness of AI, you can't avoid it. When you engage in any kind of transactions, if you're trying to buy something, if you're trying to do a service, if you're trying to book an airline ticket, whatever it is, you're dealing with AI. And I think that's an issue. The question is, how do we deal with it? How do we regulate it? How do we make people literate in their use of it? Because I remember many years ago doing a program at the public television station in Asheville, North Carolina, and talking about the idea of media literacy. And at that time, I was really kind of skeptical of the idea that we needed media literacy. I thought, can't people discern? I realize now I was completely wrong about that. Of course they can't. And that lack of, again, critical thinking skills and ability to judge the quality of information, that's bad from a journalistic perspective, but it's bad from a matter of kind of public policy and debate, because if we can't discern truth from falsity, I don't know how we even begin to have a discussion or debate.
Yeah, fascinating. Kay, hold on, Gail. Kay, you want to say something?
Well, I'm a little perturbed right now because I just had to shut down a WBI town hall because there was one participant who kept bringing up a litigious matter and wouldn't shut up about it. She wants to attack a staff person over an allegation of conflict of interest, which doesn't belong in a public meeting. If you want to talk about it, it should be an executive session committee. And I was trying to say that, and she wouldn't let me say that, and I kept trying to mute her, and she kept unmuting herself, and so I just shut down the meeting. It was 2 hours, 26 minutes into it. So I'm a little upset because I've never, ever had to do that. I'm a very strong free speecher myself. But about AI, I do the WBAI LSB minutes, and I've tried to use AI. One time I did, but it's not programmed with Robert's rules,
No.
So if you discuss something, it describes it as if you made a decision. It doesn't recognize, passed without objection, or voted on things. It just doesn't recognize that. So I can't use AI. And I was also personally concerned they're using AI to make medical decisions for all of us on these insurance companies. it's just kind of like going around in circles trying to file an appeal for some of the stuff that they deny.
I
And
mean,
I'm comparing it to a time in our history when we developed the ability to splice genes was going back to 1972. And the government declined to pass any legislation to regulate it. And then the industry itself came up with the SILHA conference in 1975, which was kind of like passed some principles for regulating it. But so far to this date, the only thing regulating genetic research is the industry itself. And we've gone through another big technology change with AI. And this GOP controlled legislature declined to pass any legislation to regulate it. And that's another, it just reminds me of that whole previous time.
yeah,
And it may be another reason why he wants to mess with the election, because there's powerful economic interests behind this AI stuff.
I mean, absolutely. I think, you put your finger on what, I mean, one of my areas of research or scholarship is, as people say, is the whole data privacy issue. And what you were talking about in terms of regulation of genetic material, I mean, that's adjacent to this because it comes up in the area of biometrics and things like that. And of course, the Europeans are way ahead of us here in the United States in terms of trying to regulate personally identifiable information. One of the huge obstacles to passing meaningful regulation here has been obviously one industry pushback, but from my own perspective, it's a First Amendment problem too, because the government's ability, I believe, to regulate truthful, accurate information should be relatively minimal. Journalists, that's what we trade in, and we don't want government telling us, what we can do with truthful, accurate information. But because of things like privacy and the implications for that, that's why the Europeans have been so aggressive about trying to regulate that. But again, with huge pushback from the government. So you've got that problem. And I think AI raises many of the same issues because the AI people are trying very hard to argue that AI and what it creates is subject to First Amendment protection. And so even if don't even get into the kind of the monetary justifications and interests that are playing here, that's a big unanswered question about whether this kind of stuff is copyrightable to start with, but whether it's protected by the First Amendment as well. And it's not easy to just say, well, of course it's not. It's because remember, computer code is protected by the First Amendment. There were cases that were brought in the early 2000s that established that. So it's not a totally bogus argument at all to say that there are First Amendment implications to trying to regulate AI. And that makes it even more complicated.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting question, Kay. Actually, Siri talked back to me a couple of weeks ago. I couldn't believe it. Out of the blue, Siri starts talking to me. I said, "What?" Sort of took me back. And the issue of the access to foreign journalism to me is very important. I remember when I used to be able to read Phoebus, totally unedited. And for those who don't know, Phoebus comes out in World War II. It's a product of the OSS. It was a product of the CIA afterwards, but it was an unfiltered, to some extent, digest of international news from all over the world. And if you were in a good university that had a collection of it, it was an eye opener to go in and read all the different accounts and, let's say, daily press coverage in Togo or Cameroon in depth. And that's gone. You can't access that kind of information anymore. And and I can just think of all these other resources that you just don't have at your fingertips to allow you to understand the world. Gail, you had a comment or you wanted to make?
Well, I've kind of lost the thread. It was way back when, regarding these worries about AI, and let's say you were talking about, as a professor, I guess you were speaking about students. The other night I was in Butler Library at Columbia, and little kids behind the desk in the library were telling me that all the librarians are up in arms because of the inaccurate citations that are invented by AI. So it sounds to me as if it's becoming common knowledge. I mean, these are not these are people that have impact on, let's say, undergrads, or at least those
Well,
like Columbia. I mean, maybe there should be an intro course on judging accuracy, and the importance of copyright, which is something I don't understand at all. Why? How are these cases with the New York, or maybe they're over? I don't even know. I'm not up on this anymore. But the New York Times being completely glommed into whatever AI databases. Where does that stand?
those cases are still pending, is the answer. And we don't know. But yes, I mean, it's this whole idea that these large language models can just gobble up all of this stuff and then use it for other purposes. And they're arguing, I believe, that essentially this is a transformative use. And under traditional copyright law, you can take copyrighted material and transform it into something else.
Right.
And that can, in some circumstances, be a fair use under traditional copyright law. So that's going to be the question. Is this transformative, or are they simply, gobbling up all of your stuff and repackaging it, but not actually transforming it?
So the old idea, you could take little pieces. I go back to my days as a photo archivist in the Getty Trust. We were constantly talking about photo copyrights, and the law did change regarding film and photos. And where does it stand now that you could insert an entire edition of the New York Times into your gobbledygook because it's a novel use?
Transformative use.
Transformative is the
word. Yeah, that's the word. And
I'm very transformative. What can I go rob a bank? I mean, really?
I mean, it is that tension, frankly, that has always existed between the First Amendment and copyright, because copyright, as you know, is actually in the Constitution. The First Amendment is an amendment to the Constitution. But when the Constitution was first written, the whole idea, the need for copyright was enshrined there. But then over time, through the interpretation of the First Amendment, the court recognized the fair use concept so that you wouldn't be able to basically stop people from using your copyrighted material in perpetuity. But as you know, the copyright term has ebbed and flowed depending upon who's in Congress, how long it lasts. But the key is, I think, trying to underscore the fact, or at least ask the question, is what AI is doing, is it creative? Is it transformative? Or is it simply, going through some kind of algorithmic process that is simply exploiting this creative material that was done by somebody else? And I don't know how it's going to come out. It's one of those big questions that the courts are going to have to sort out.
Yeah, you want to jump in with something? Okay. You just have to unmute, Kay.
I'm listening right now. Thank you.
All right. Well, one thing I wanted to do is just, sort of to turn it back a little bit to what we began with, and sort of end the discussion tonight in a way, because we're going to talk more about Minneapolis tomorrow with you. And that is, so where are we going with all this with Trump? Where do you see what is the quote resistance to this media onslaught? Because we're barely a year into him we're not even at a year yet. We're 3 days away from a year, and we've just had this unprecedented assault. And again, I remember reading the Project 2025 for the Reagan administration, which was a multi-volume study done in 1980, 81. So I wasn't really surprised. And, people here know that, we took very seriously Project 2025. But you're right. It wasn't made into digestible, mass understandable, this is what's going to happen, guys, when they're in power type of understanding. So how do you see the resistance to this developing? How do you understand that?
Well, I try to have optimism. You mentioned that I taught in Latvia in 2016, and I got a good dose of sort of what the concept of resistance was all about, because I had an apartment that was near where the KGB house had been, and I learned a lot about the impact of resistance among the Latvian people, and when the Russians were gone, how things changed and how they did things like they purged their judiciary and put in new people because they realized that things couldn't change if those kinds of fundamental institutions were not changed as well. Anyway, so I guess my point would be, I think it really comes down to a question about how much we trust our institutions as they exist today. I'm a lawyer, as you know. I've been a member of the bar of the Supreme Court for a long time. I have great respect of the Supreme Court as an institution in principle. I have very little respect for the current court.
Yeah.
This shakes me to the end of my toes, because I've certainly disagreed with Supreme Court rulings over the years, but I have never, in the time I've been involved in the practice of law, and that's been since 1979, had so little confidence in the independence of the court, going back to that word we were using earlier. Independence is key, and I don't see it there. So I guess my short answer is my trust initially would have been in the courts. We still see some resistance coming from the judiciary, including people that were appointed by even somebody like Ronald Reagan. And I think there's hope there, but I wouldn't put all my eggs in that basket. I think Congress obviously is completely AWOL at this time, which would suggest that if we do have midterm elections later this year, if there were a huge change in the composition of Congress, that we might get some pushback. It's all might, maybe if the stars align properly, that this is going to happen. But I kind of start with the idea you deal with problems in the government by looking at the other co-equal branches and expect them to step up and do what they need to do. The other piece of it, though, I think would be in what some people would refer to sort of as civil society, which is we see how the Trump administration has very pointedly targeted institutions. Not the judiciary, yes, but not that. Lawyers, going after law firms. The law firms who would be the very ones that would be mounting the cases
Right.
on behalf of their clients, capitulating as well. I'm appalled by this.
Right.
Universities.
Skadden Arps. I remember when Skadden used to actually employ people doing pro bono work. And it's amazing to watch.
It is so disheartening to me. And in talking to people that are, media lawyers, who some of whom are in these firms, they're saying, they're not listening to us because there are other economic concerns that are driving those decisions that are being made. The academy, universities, watching them capitulate.
Right, we haven't even got.
That's a whole nother discussion. But the point is, lawyers, academics, and other institutions that you would expect to kind of step up and be the ones to bring these challenges. And of course, there are exceptions. There are some who are doing it. But it is really, really appalling to me to see all of this. And again, talking to my friends in Latvia, I feel as if we are really not stepping up to the plate in this country. And I can't explain to you exactly why that is, except that everybody's in these institutions seem to be utterly craven or scared to death to stand up to this. And I don't know how you stiffen people's spines.
Yeah.
And the main thing we were going to talk about today, of course, was the media, and that's the last peg in all this. I've never liked the term fourth estate because I think it's a trap. I don't think we should ever think of the media as an arm of the government, even implicitly, which is what you do when you call the media the fourth estate. But they have been a really important check on government over the years. And to the extent that they're not doing that, that is a grave disservice to the people of this country. So I wish I had a solution.
Right.
I don't, but I think I still maintain maybe a hopeless kind of hope that these institutions will wake up and recognize that they've got to fight back, if only for self-preservation, because capitulating to Trump is not self-preservation. It is slavery.
Exactly. No, it's tyranny. It's a very important conversation. Uh, and there's a new sense to me of a new form of radical politics that has to occur that's beyond something we can imagine right now. Because, sure, you can look at what happened in New York with the election of Mamdani. It's unusual kind of situation to happen. But what you guys are going through in Minneapolis is, to me, and we'll talk about it in greater depth, and I'm glad you brought the universities because, both Gail and I are very aware of the reaction at Columbia University to this cave-in to the Trump administration. It is not a popular uh, option. And I've had long, very heated discussions with one or two of the trustees who have the guts to actually come out and fight and argue about it. And I've called them cowards and other things. Um, and it's but what particularly is stifling in this is you see what's going on right now. I mean, so what are people going to do? Like they take, when we're having a debate about actually seizing Greenland? I mean,
I
how
know.
absurd is this? And then
I
you
mean,
feel that you
yeah.
can't discuss this because you might be attacked or your money pulled. I mean, this is absurd.
It is, and you're kind of left with the question of what is it that the Trump administration has on these institutions
Yeah.
that make them so prepared to capitulate? Money,
Money,
obviously.
money
I mean,
talks. Yeah.
for universities, it's grants and things like
Right.
that, and I understand that. I'm not suggesting that those are totally frivolous concerns. Of course, they're not. But you're ultimately left with, is everybody on the Republican side in Congress totally vulnerable and enthralled to Trump and his supporters? Is it? I mean, I don't get it, and I don't. I wish I knew,
Right.
because I am so profoundly disturbed by the notion that we are basically just a bunch of spineless, scared people who have lived. I mean, I remember years ago when I was talking to a European at a conference on freedom of expression, and he said, "You Americans have slept too long on the feather bed of the First Amendment." And I remember thinking, yeah, right, of course, you would say that, you're European. But then it occurs to me as I'm looking at what's going on now, have we just lived in this highly self-satisfied world here where we just
Good
assumed
point.
our institutions were going to work and taken it for granted? And now when the rubber really meets the road, we're finding out that they don't.
Right. Yeah. Very good point. Kay, you want to comment on this before? Kay, you have your.
Yeah, okay. I have a couple comments. One is I used to ask myself this question like in the when we were, talking about supporting independence movements in Central America. And I went through the history of, for example, El Salvador. They went through 35 years of rigged elections before the FSLN finally came about. And I think it's just, people don't want to die. I mean, look what's happening in Iran. They did have masses and masses and masses of people in the streets, and 500 people have been shot. I mean, the last count, I don't know what it is now. Thousands have been arrested. And look at, I mean, and so that's one point is just, I'm a physical coward too. Another thing that people need to remember is how did this whole year start? It started with Elon Musk going through the entire government, all the documents, Social Security, anybody getting any kind of, support from government programs. And I cut back on all my donations to 501c3s because I was like, I'm sorry, if my income gets cut off, I have to start saving some money for my old age. And so it scared everybody, and then going on to the importance of social organizations to fight fascism. And this is a question that was raised by Timothy Snyder in his book Bloodlands, where he talked about why did the death camps occur in Eastern Europe? It's because Stalin had already gone through Eastern Europe and destroyed all of the social organizations. And that's why in Western Europe, you had, I mean, as effective as it was or wasn't, you had the resistance in France. You had people hiding people, in their attic or whatever, and yet in Eastern Europe, that didn't take place. So these social organizations, whether it's a block association or your church group or an educational group or, a media group or whatever it is, these are life-saving contacts, and we need to, but they won't exist if nobody's going to support them with donations, so it's like it's really the oligarchy attacking on all fronts is what's going on, I believe.
I think you're right. And one of the things that I'm always struck by when I did work in the countries in Eastern and Central Europe after the Soviet Union dissolved was, the Samizdat press, the kind of underground civil society groups, for lack of a better term, resistance and so forth, and the importance of that as part of the transition. But then, of course, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, I remember, coming away from places, I don't know, like Poland or Hungary or something like that, saying, this is great, they've got the keys and now everything's just going to go beautifully. Well, the reality, of course, is that democracy, especially if it's being tampered with, does not always go in the way of ensuring a robust democratic system. And I think we're coming to grips with that here in this country. That, we prided ourselves on the idea that our systems were strong, our institutions were strong, and that they could withstand any kind of a threat. I don't think, at least I didn't, maybe you all did, but it never really hit me about the notion of what I would call an internal threat, where you have an administration that, at least by all appearances, seems to be operating, yes, of course, corruptly, yes, of course, driven by greed, but also heavily susceptible to foreign influences, which are not benign in any shape or form, and are undermining so much of, whether it's NATO or whether it's, our elections or whatever. It's all really shaking our institutions to the core. And someone, I mean, I don't want to get blown away. I mean, I'm not going to stand up in front of a tank like in Tiananmen Square and wait to be blown away. So I absolutely understand what you're saying about people don't want to get hurt. But there has to be some way to address the situation, because I'm not a political scientist, so I don't know, I'm not going to sit and try to deconstruct how the Democrats blew, the last election or whatever. But I think the fact that there is no clear, well-organized, well-thought-out opposition to what is going on in the current administration is probably at the root of the crisis that we're in. All these institutions are pieces of it, but ultimately, if we basically don't have a two-party system anymore because one of the parties is not viable, then we are in the situation we're in today, at least on the face of it. I don't know. I keep hoping that the next round of elections will change things, but we'll have to wait and see.
All right. Well, we look forward to talking to you tomorrow at 8 o'clock, and we'll continue this discussion and
about everything that's so great here in Minnesota, where it is 0 degrees as I look at my thermometer.
oh, it's 0 degrees. Oh boy.
Yeah. So, but we will talk tomorrow. And
Yes.
thank
Thank you
for
so
this
much, Jane. It
opportunity.
was really sweet of you to spend time with us today. Thank
It's
you.
my pleasure. We'll talk tomorrow.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.